Hey everyone. I did something at my son's birthday party a couple of days ago, and that's why I'm posting on Reddit for advice and a fair verdict. So I, 28 male, celebrated my son's third birthday 3 days ago. It was mostly our co-workers with kids and a couple of my son's friends from his daycare with their parents. I'd also invited my estranged parents to the party after they contacted me 2 weeks ago, asking if they could meet me to make amends with me. Some backstory here, so it makes sense why I don't get along with them. So my parents kicked me out 10 years ago, a couple of months before I was supposed to start college. To make it extra special and poetic, they also made sure to kick me out on my 18th birthday. My parents were never the most loving or caring people. I'd say that I was pretty much ignored and unwanted throughout my childhood, and the only reason my parents didn't kick me out way before 18 was probably because it would be illegal. But they did, so the first chance they got, and I wasn't even surprised that they were kicking me out. I was just surprised that they were doing it on my birthday, and just a couple of months before college was about to begin. I tried to talk them into letting me live with them just until I graduated and covering my tuition. But they were very sure of what they wanted to do. They wanted me out of their lives so they could do whatever they wanted to, so far instead of wasting their time taking care of me. Their plans were to start their own business, which is a financial risk they couldn't take as long as they had me to look after, and then travel all the states in an RV. It was a great plan. I have nothing against what they wanted to do, but not at the cost of my future. I tried every manipulation tactic in the book to make them change their plans, but with no luck. I even resorted to crying and sobbing, but that didn't help either. And they told me I had 1 month to vacate the house and find a way for myself to cover my own expenses. I'd already been working as a cashier at one of the stores in the local mall and saving some money to buy a car, but after my parents' talk, I decided to leave and put that money to use. I didn't have much, but I was extremely upset with my parents. I'd never liked them much, but after my birthday, I hated them, so within the next 2 days I texted all my relatives if they'd be willing to help me out. Most of them turned their backs on me, which was unsurprising, and was a huge part of the reason I'd never spoken anything against my parents before, because I'd never had anyone to count on. My friends were nice, but they had their own lives and wouldn't want me sticking around to live with them either. But I'm lucky that one of my distant relatives, one of my mother's cousins, Uncle Kevin, responded to my email and told me that I could come live with him, but I'd need to make myself useful for as long as I would stay. I just needed somewhere to go and live before college started in the fall, so I agreed, and the very next day I'd packed my bags and left to travel to Utah so I could live with Uncle Kevin. I didn't tell my parents anything, and neither did they ask. I didn't even tell them goodbye one last time before I left, and I don't suppose they cared much about it. Uncle Kevin was a nice guy, and he did make me help him out with a lot of things around the house, but it was nothing impossible. He also ran his own diner, which was pretty popular among the locals, and he told me that I could work there as the cashier for the time being, and if I was diligent and sincere, he'd pay for my tuition. He was a little eccentric, but he was rolling in money from his grandparents' inheritance, and since he had no family of his own, he could afford to spend his money on things like these. And that's how I paid for college, by showing my uncle just how serious I was at the diner by working well and honestly. After I graduated and moved out, I offered to start paying him back, but he told me not to bother and said that he'd collect his dues when I was a bigger success story. He was weird but sweet. Unfortunately, he never came to collect his dues since just a few years after I left. He passed away from a stroke. It was sudden, and by the time his housekeeper got him to the hospital, it was too late already. I'm thankful for whatever he did for me, and I'll always be grateful that he was able to at least be present at my wedding and take the place of my parents. Uncle Kevin never really got along with his family, including my mother as a child or even as an adult, so my parents were never able to find out where I spent those years and who covered my tuition for me. Or maybe they'd found out, but they just didn't bother to contact me. Either way, I never heard from my parents. even once after I left their house until a few weeks ago. They told me that they'd found me on social media through a cousin who's helped them trace me down since they'd heard from people that I was now married and even had a 3-year-old son of my own. They apologized in their message for all that they'd done all those years ago and told me that now they'd love to come and see me and make things right with me, mostly because they wanted to meet my wife and son. I thought it was really half-hearted and almost didn't reply to them, but they sent another one within a day of that message saying that they really wanted to meet their grandson while they were still around, and it was evident that they were trying to emotionally manipulate me. Nevertheless, I agreed and told them to come over on the day of my son's birthday. I didn't have anything in mind particularly, but after talking to my wife and discussing the messages with her, she told me she didn't mind having them over as long as I was okay with it. She knows all the history with them, and we've been married for 5 years now. It's been 10 years since my parents kicked me out, so she told me that if I believed it was water under the bridge, then I could invite them. Her own parents had passed away when she was really little, and she'd been raised by her grandparents. Both of them had passed away in the last couple of years, so I could tell that she really wanted some family to be present at the party. I didn't care about reconciliation, but I felt like my wife actually did want them and wasn't saying it because she didn't want to strong-arm me into anything. So I did invite my parents, for my wife's sake. And on the day of the party, they arrived an hour early before all the other guests so we could get some one-on-one time with each other. It was all very awkward and uncomfortable, but we tried to make small talk after I'd introduced them to my wife and son. They were polite and respectful for the most part. But then at one point, my wife went into the kitchen to make my dad some tea. And that's when my mother told me that she was here to discuss something else as well. And she didn't want to say it in front of my wife, so they'd asked her for tea. Now that it was just the 3 of us, my parents apologized to me again and said that they'd come to their senses now, that they'd done whatever they'd wanted to, and felt like they had really treated me badly during my childhood. I thought that it was pretty nice of them to apologize and that finally they'd started acting like human beings to me. But before I could accept their apology in person, they went on to tell me that they now needed money. And that was a major reason that they were here right now. Apparently, they'd blown through a lot of their savings while traveling, and now they were falling short while trying to pay for all their bills on time and wanted my help to live. They knew that my wife and I were relatively well off. She was a real estate agent and I worked in a bank, so we were comfortable and could afford to help them. I was very irritated by that because it just cheapened everything that they'd said to me, because now I felt like it was all just a ploy to get me to help them out financially. They'd even used their grandson in their tactics to try and make me soften up towards them, and while it hadn't been very effective on me, my wife had fallen for it. I didn't blame her because she didn't know just how awful my parents were and really missed her family, which is why she was so keen for us to fix our relationship. But I regretted ever having them over. I didn't say anything to them because just afterwards my wife walked in with the tea for my dad and coffee for the rest of us, and she seemed very happy. So I just stayed quiet, and my mother told me to think about it. My wife did ask me what we'd been talking about, but I told her that we'd talk about it later because I didn't want to get into an argument with my parents around the same time as when the guests were supposed to start arriving. My wife talked to my parents some more for the next couple of minutes, and it was an easy flowing conversation for her, since she seemed to like them, but I sat there quietly because I just wanted them to leave before I lost it at them. Luckily, the first guests arrived in just the nick of time, and I jumped at the opportunity to distract myself from this. Once the guests were there, I busied myself with my son and the party arrangements, and then it was time for my son to cut the cake, which went well. Everyone had fun. Right after that, I was about to go into the kitchen with my wife, but my parents stopped me and asked me once more if I'd come to a decision yet. So I snapped, and I told them that they could wait in the living room with all the other guests, and I'd let them know shortly. After everyone had received their slice, I took my spot in the middle of the living room and started off with a speech that I'd been preparing in my head after my parents stopped me outside the kitchen. I introduced my parents to all the other guests since nobody had met them before, and they looked pleased that I was treating them well, but the smiles dropped from their faces as soon as I went on the next part of my speech, where I started narrating the story about my childhood and how they'd kicked me out, after which I had to be taken in by my uncle. I wrapped it all up in light-hearted jokes and everyone was laughing a little, but my parents looked humiliated and my wife had a poker face throughout. I mentioned how my parents and I hadn't spoken for 10 years after they'd kicked me out, and finally, recently, they'd contacted me to meet their grandson and I'd almost ignored and blocked them. But then I changed my mind because I was just grateful that, unlike other nightmarish parents, at least mine weren't after my money. I was able to pass it off as a joke, and then I sat back down with the guests while my parents chuckled along uncomfortably since I'd managed to make the whole speech sound like a stand-up bit, so it didn't ruin the birthday vibes. After some time, the guests started leaving and my parents were the first ones to go. They left in a rush, and when I saw them to the door, they shot me the nastiest looks they could, but didn't say anything, which I was thankful for because the last thing I wanted was to argue with them right outside the house. Once all the guests were gone and we'd put our son to bed, I finally had the chance to talk to my wife and explain everything to her. But before I could say anything, she lashed out at me and told me that my speech was unnecessary and stupid. I needed to apologize to all the guests and make sure they weren't uncomfortable, and also to my parents for humiliating them for no reason. I stopped her there and told her what my parents had been here for, but she said that she didn't care and said that I'd apparently ruined our son's birthday and made it all about me with that speech. I thought that was unfair because our son was just 3 years old and it wasn't like he was even going to remember any of this in a few years or even in a few weeks. As for the guests, they just found it funny because of the way I told the story, keeping in mind that this was my son's birthday and not the appropriate occasion for any of what I'd done, but I just had to let my parents know how disappointing they were as human beings. My wife wasn't on board with any of it and told me that I needed to apologize to everyone present for my bad behavior. I was already very stressed out that day because of my parents and the way my wife was freaking out over something that hadn't even bothered anyone else, but it didn't sit right with me. I felt like she was totally invalidating my feelings about this situation, even after she'd heard what my parents had come here for. So I snapped at her too and told her that I'd invited my parents because she had wanted me to. So if anything, she should be the one who should be a little understanding right now. But she was just thinking about how she felt, and I called her self-involved. She started crying after I snapped, and I felt really bad about it, and I still do. I tried to comfort her immediately, but she shook me off and told me that I was the one being self-involved and hypocritical, and until I apologized to everyone who attended the party, she wouldn't speak to me. She even moved all her bedtime stuff to the guest bedroom and has been sleeping there ever since. We haven't spoken since that night because I haven't apologized to any of the guests yet. I don't think what I did was out of line or anything, and I feel like my wife's overreacting to what happened at the party. I haven't heard back from my parents yet, and nobody from the party has said anything about my speech either. I feel like she's built it up all in her head and thinks that people are going to judge us for that. But that's really not the case here, and I can't even communicate that to her because she just refuses to even speak to me. I also feel like she's not trying to understand where I'm coming from because I ignored my parents for the sake of my wife and to maintain the peace before the party once already. But I just couldn't take it a second time because they were putting too much pressure on me. And the thing that I'd said about my wife wanting my parents at the party more than I did was probably true. She didn't deny it when I brought it up during our argument on the night of the party. My wife's been acting like I totally ruined the party, but nobody cares as much as she does. I don't want to apologize to anyone because I don't think I did anything wrong. I tried to do everything the right way, but even that didn't end well for me somehow. My parents kicked me out at 18 and abandoned me for 10 years, so I think it was completely fair for me to humiliate them at a party after they tried to screw me over once more by asking me for financial help over and over again. I tried to deal with things calmly and only acted emotionally after my parents took things too far. And I really think my wife needs to understand that. I guess I can't apologize to her for calling herself involved. That was not cool, but that's really the most I feel like I should do. Apart from that, I absolutely don't think I have anything to apologize for. I can even consider apologizing to the guests, but certainly not to my parents. So that AITA for making a speech at my son's birthday party to humiliate my parents who had asked me for money to help them after they kicked me out and cut me off for 10 years? Update 1. So I talked to my wife about this today. The comments section on my original post was pretty divided on what I should have done. So I decided to just screw it and talk to my wife because that's how the marriage will work anyway. It's been 6 days since the party and 6 days of not talking to each other and sleeping in different rooms. We tried to keep it low key for the sake of our son, but he's not old enough to notice these things yet. So there was even less of an excuse for us to talk to each other. But today, before we left for work, I stopped her and told her that we absolutely needed to talk. She didn't ignore me, luckily, and our son was having breakfast in the other room, so we could talk peacefully. I told her I was sorry for calling her self-involved, but apart from that, I didn't see any reason for me to be sorry. I didn't ruin the party for anyone like she believed, and nobody even cares about the speech because nobody's brought it up with me yet, not even my parents. I told her as gently and respectfully as I could that I believed she'd overreacted a bit, and then waited for her to respond. She agreed that she had indeed overreacted and said that for the past few days, once her anger over what I'd done had cooled off a bit, she'd realized that she'd acted very selfishly and hadn't been thinking about my feelings at all. She also conceded that she'd sort of made me invite my parents to reconcile, even though she hadn't verbally said it. While we'd been discussing the idea, she'd been very non-verbally trying to influence me because she was the one who actually wanted a happy family for us. So I wasn't wrong about that after all, and she apologized to me for it as well. Her reasons were pretty valid if I think about it emotionally, because all she'd really wanted was for us to have a complete family that she'd never really had as a kid. She'd hoped that as a married woman she'd get some part of it. But here too, her in-laws were estranged, so there was no chance that her son could get the same love and affection from his grandparents that she'd been lucky to have. She didn't get the love from her parents that she deserved when she was young because they'd passed away so early, and now her son would be loved by his parents, but he'd never have any grandparents there for him. Of course, that meant a lot to her because she'd been raised by her grandparents after her parents passed away, so it was kind of a big deal for her. It was all these issues with her and her need to have a complete family that made her spaz out the other day, and she acknowledged it. I also apologized for not discussing these things with her and for the lack of communication that had actually led to all of this. So to sum it up, we talked things through, and afterwards we came to the conclusion that we were going to have to deal with this in therapy. We already go to individual therapy, but now we're going to consider couples counseling as well for a few days, unrelated reasons as well. Thank you for all the comments, you guys. Update 2. I posted an update here yesterday, and I really didn't expect to be back so soon, but I am, thanks to my parents. They sent me a lawsuit claiming that I'd stolen $50,000 from them before I'd run away 10 years ago. And now that they'd finally managed to track me down, they wanted that money back. Obviously, none of that is true, and I feel sorry for the idiot who's agreed to get involved in this as an attorney. Must be some guy who's really in need of money, because otherwise I can't imagine anyone agreeing to this. Anyway, I'm obviously not going to entertain any of this nonsense and have contacted my lawyer already. My wife took back everything that she said about me having to apologize to my parents, because now she's seen what kind of people they really are. I'm sure they think they can get away with this even now, since I was relatively kind to them back when they first came by, but they'll know that I just behaved myself back then because it was my son's birthday. Right now, I have no reason to think about the consequences. So I'm posting all about this online, and I'm going to make sure that everyone knows about not just what they're trying right now, but also what they've done to me back in the past. Update 3. So I posted everything. Every single detail that I'd shared here is now up on my Facebook profile. It's been 20 minutes and I haven't received any texts or calls as such. But I'm waiting because I know people are going to be mad and pissed. Especially since I mentioned how nobody in my family had taken me in, but now that I'm in a somewhat decent position, everyone acts friendly with me. I've never invited anyone to any events, just to be clear, but my relatives who'd shut me out back then have all turned over a new leaf in the last few years and tried to be on good terms with me, which is all fake, obviously. Just now they have their own kinds to think of, and it doesn't hurt to have a well-connected relative who works in a bank and is in a position to get them jobs. So I know stuff is going to go down now. I'm just waiting for them. Update 4. Hey all, I'm back after almost 3 days. So my parents went completely ballistic after I made that post and called me up frantically several times after the post to try and get me to take it down. But I didn't listen until they texted me and promised me that they'd withdraw their case. I just needed that in writing somehow, and I have that now after they blocked me. The real nastiness was because of my relatives who I'd mentioned by name in my post, and they were so triggered by it that they commented really nasty things about me, my wife, and even my son under the post, which just proves my point about them being terrible, selfish and idiotic folks. Their kids were the ones with the decency to apologize for their parents' actions, which was really backward for me, but at least some people had class and brains. I've taken that post down now, but a lot of people have seen it already, so everyone who turned their backs on me in the past got their karma, and I'm glad for it. Long story short, the parents withdrew their case. I got back to my relatives. My wife and I are still going strong. Thanks for being here, Reddit. But I think I'm going to take a break now. Signing off. Bye. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.